It starts with a father who was afraid of his own children, the way a lot of the worst stories in this family do. His name was Cronus, and he'd taken his own throne by force, cutting down his father Uranus with a sickle and leaving him with a curse on his way out. What you did to me, your own son will do to you. A child of yours will rise up and take everything, the same way you just took it from me. Cronus believed that curse completely, and he built the rest of his reign around making sure it never came true. He married his sister, a titaness named Rhea, and when she began having children, he found a solution so brutally simple it still makes gods wince to hear it told. The moment each child was born, he took it from its mother's arms and swallowed it whole. A child who never gets the chance to grow up, by his reasoning, can never grow up to overthrow you. Hustera went down first, then Demeter, then Hera, then Poseidon. The child this whole telling belongs to tonight, swallowed just as thoroughly and just as immediately as the sister born right before him. He never took a single breath of open air, never saw his mother's face for longer than the seconds it took his father to cross the room and take him from her. He simply existed, briefly, and then existed inside his own father's stomach instead, alongside whichever of his siblings had already gone down before him, for years, with no way of knowing whether the darkness he'd been born into was simply what the whole world was. Hades went down after him, the last of the five, and Rhea, who had now watched 5 of her own children disappear down her husband's throat one after another, decided the 6th time would not go the same way. She gave birth in secret on the island of Crete and handed her husband a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes instead of the child underneath it. Cronus, a titan powerful enough to have overthrown the sky itself, looked at that bundle, felt no suspicion at all, and swallowed the rock without a second thought. That 6th child, hidden away and raised in secret, while his father believed the succession problem was already solved, was Zeus. You already know, if you were here for the last telling, how the rest of that part goes. Zeus grew up in hiding, came back for his father years later disguised as nothing more than a cupbearer, and slipped him a drink laced with something that made him violently, thoroughly sick. Cronus retched up everything he'd swallowed, in reverse order, the stone first, landing on the ground with an unceremonious thud, and then, one after another, his 5 actual children, each of them fully grown despite the years spent inside their father's body, because that's simply how gods work. Time doesn't dent them the way it dents the rest of us. Poseidon came up somewhere in the middle of that reversal, not first, not last, blinking in daylight he hadn't seen since before his own birth, standing among brothers and sisters he was meeting, in every meaningful sense, for the very first time. A little brother he'd never known existed had just saved all their lives with nothing more than a rock and a strong stomach for potions. There wasn't much time for a proper reunion. A war was already starting, and Poseidon, however strange his first day of freedom must have felt, picked up whatever weapon was nearest and got straight to fighting in it. That war ran 10 years, mountains thrown like stones, monsters freed from Tartarus to even the odds, an entire generation of titans finally broken and buried. Poseidon fought through every year of it standing shoulder to shoulder with his brothers, and when the dust settled and the titans were locked away for good, the 3 of them, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, sat down to work out who ruled what. They drew lots. I've told you before how strange that decision looks from a distance. 3 of the most powerful beings ever to exist, settling the single largest question in creation with something close to picking straws. Zeus drew the sky, Hades drew the underworld, and Poseidon drew the sea. Here's where I want to slow down, because the last time I told it from Zeus's side of the table, and Zeus got the better draw, and everybody at that table knew it, including Poseidon. The sky sits above everything. A king who rules from up there gets to see further than anyone below him, gets first say over weather and light, and every mortal glancing upward to pray. The sea is enormous, and the sea is powerful, and the sea, by any fair accounting, still came in second. Poseidon took it anyway, because that's simply how the lots fell, and he built an entire kingdom out of the half of the world nobody else particularly wanted, 3/4 of the Earth's surface, if you want to get technical about it, more territory by simple measurement than his two brothers combined. But territory was never really the argument. Status was the argument. And for the rest of tonight, in one way or another, you're going to watch a god who got the biggest kingdom spend an awful lot of energy making sure nobody forgot it. That's Poseidon's whole character, laid out in the very first afternoon of his reign, if you want the short version before we get into the long one. Enormous power, real and total control over 2/3 of the world, and a chip on his shoulder, the size of the ocean he ruled, because his little brother got the sky, and thrones, even divine ones, apparently come with sibling rivalry built right into the foundation. Let's talk about what he actually got, because ruler of the sea undersells the job by quite a lot. Poseidon's palace sat beneath the waves off the coast of Uga, built of gold, glimmering and everlasting, untouched by storm or tide, because he was the one who controlled both. From there, he commanded every current, every wave, every calm morning and every ship-splitting gale across the entire known world. Sailors prayed to him before every voyage, not out of love particularly, but out of the same practical fear you'd offer any landlord who could flood your basement on a whim. Keep him happy, and the crossing went smoothly. Forget him, even once, and you'd find out exactly how thin the line is between a calm sea and a grave. He carried a trident, 3-pronged, forged, like his brother's signature weapons, by the Cyclopes down in their smithy, a gift given to each of the 3 victorious brothers once the war against the Titans was finally won. Zeus got the thunderbolt. Hades got a helm that made him invisible. Poseidon got a spear capable of splitting the earth itself, stirring the ocean into fury with a single strike, or when the mood took him, simply cracking open the ground beneath an entire city's feet. If you've ever wondered why the ancient Greeks credited earthquakes to a sea god rather than some separate deity of stone and shaking ground, that's the reason. Poseidon didn't just rule the water. He ruled everything the water touched, and quite a bit of what it didn't. They called him Earthshaker for exactly that reason, Anusagas, in the old tongue, and it's worth understanding that this wasn't a poetic flourish. When the ground actually shook beneath a Greek city, when buildings actually cracked and toppled without warning, the explanation that made sense to the people living through it was simple. Poseidon was angry, or Poseidon was restless, or Poseidon, deep beneath the waves, had simply shifted his weight the wrong way. A god who could drown you also, apparently, held the very ground you stood on hostage the moment you set foot on dry land to escape him. He had one more domain that tends to surprise people who only think of him as a sea god: horses. Poseidon Huppas, they called him in that particular role creator of the horse itself, by some tellings, having struck the earth with his trident during a contest of his own devising, and brought the very first horse bursting up out of the rock, wild and magnificent, a gift to a world that hadn't known how to move quickly across open land until that moment. Chariot racers prayed to him before every race. Horse breeders kept small shrines in his honor. It's an odd pairing, sea and stallion, until you remember that both of them, to the ancient Greek mind, share the same essential quality: raw, thundering, barely controllable power, moving in waves. Sea, earthquake, horse, 3 domains, and if you look closely, they're really just one domain wearing 3 different masks. Force that cannot be reasoned with, only endured. That's the god you're about to spend the rest of tonight getting to know. Let's find out what he did with all that force once he actually had somewhere to point it. Every god in this family needs a queen eventually, and Poseidon's courtship of his own is one of the gentlest stories in his whole catalogue. which, given some of what's coming later tonight, is worth appreciating while we have the chance. Her name was Amphitrite, one of the Nereids, sea nymphs, 50 sisters by most counts, daughters of an old sea god named Nereus who'd ruled these same waters in a quieter, gentler way long before Poseidon ever drew his lot and moved in. Poseidon saw her dancing on the island of Naxos with her sisters, and the way most of these stories tend to go by now, you'd expect an immediate pursuit, a transformation, a chase across open water. She ran instead, fled from his attention all the way to the edge of the world, by some tellings hiding with Atlas himself at the western boundary of everything, wanting no part of the sea god's interest, no matter how powerful or well-intentioned it might have been. Poseidon, to his credit here, didn't chase her down by force. He sent a messenger instead, a dolphin, clever and gentle, who tracked her down at the edge of the world and made his case with patience rather than pressure, coaxing her back toward the sea and toward the god who'd sent him with nothing sharper than kind words and good timing. Amphitrite, won over eventually by the dolphin's gentle persistence rather than any direct pressure from Poseidon himself, agreed to return and become his bride. Poseidon never forgot the favor. He placed that dolphin in the night sky as its own small constellation, a permanent thank you for a matchmaking job well done, and to this day, if you know where to look, Delphinus still swims quietly among the stars, a reminder that even a god known best for temper and trident once needed a little gentle help winning over the woman he wanted. Amphitrite became queen of the sea in full, ruling at Poseidon's side from that golden palace at Aegae, mother to Triton, a merman's son, half human above the waist and finned below, who grew up to become his father's herald, blowing a great conch shell to calm the waves whenever Poseidon rode out across his own kingdom in a chariot pulled by horses with fins instead of hooves, more magnificent a procession than nearly anything else the ancient world could picture moving across open water. It's a genuinely sweet story, as these things go in this family. No jealous rival goddess scheming from a distance. No trick, no deception, no cruelty tucked into the courtship. Just a reluctant bride, a patient dolphin, and a god willing, for once, to let someone else do the convincing. I want you to hold on to that gentleness for a minute, because it's not going to define the rest of tonight's telling nearly as much as you might hope. Amphitrite got the version of Poseidon capable of patience. A great many others, mortal and immortal alike, were not so lucky. If you want to understand Poseidon's temper, really understand it, down in the bones of it, there's no better place to start than the day he lost a city to his own niece, and never once let it go for the rest of recorded history. There was a young, growing settlement in Attica, not yet named, prosperous enough and promising enough that two gods decided, independently, that it deserved to be theirs. Poseidon wanted it. Athene wanted it too, and rather than settle the matter the way this family usually settles things, with a war, a flood, a mountain thrown at somebody's head, the citizens of that city proposed something almost unheard of in divine affairs: a contest. Whichever god could offer the city the more valuable gift would win its patronage and its name. Poseidon went first, and he did not undersell the moment. He struck the Acropolis itself with his trident, and where the point landed, a spring burst up out of the bare rock, seawater, salt and endless, a gift meant to demonstrate his own dominion over the very ground beneath the city's feet. It was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary display. A god cracking open solid stone and pulling the sea itself up through it, right in front of the assembled citizens. There was just one problem, and it's the kind of problem that tends to undercut even the most impressive miracle. The water was salt water, undrinkable, useless for crops, useless for livestock, useless for nearly everything a growing city actually needed from a water source. Magnificent to witness, utterly impractical to live with. Athene went next, and where her uncle had gone for spectacle, she went for substance. She knelt, and planted something small and unassuming in the same rocky soil, an olive tree. The first one the world had ever seen, according to the story, its branches heavy with fruit that could be eaten, pressed into oil for cooking and lamps and healing, its wood useful for building, its very existence a promise of trade and industry, and sustained prosperity stretching generations into the future. The citizens didn't need long to decide. Some tellings have the city's own women casting the deciding votes, since they made up the majority of the assembly and favored Athene's practical gift over her uncle's dramatic one, a detail some ancient sources used to explain why women were later barred from voting in the city's affairs entirely. Poseidon supposedly furious enough at the female electorate's decision that he flooded the plain in retaliation and demanded some concession be made before he'd calm down. However that detail actually played out, the outcome itself never changed. The city took Athene's gift and Athene's name. Athens, they called it, and Athens it has been called for every one of the 3,000 years since that afternoon. Poseidon did not take the loss gracefully. He flooded the surrounding plain of Attica in a fit of temper that must have terrified the very citizens who just cast their votes. A petty, punishing gesture from a god who'd just been told, plainly and publicly, that seawater wasn't actually worth very much when an olive tree was sitting right next to it. And here's the detail that tells you everything about how deeply this particular loss sat with him. He never let it go, not for the rest of this whole family's story. That salt spring stayed on the Acropolis for centuries afterward, a permanent reminder of the contest, and Athenian religious practice took pains, generation after generation, to keep honoring Poseidon alongside Athene in the very temples built to celebrate her victory over him, not out of generosity, but out of the very practical fear that a bitter, still sulking earthquake god might decide, one restless afternoon, to remind the whole city exactly whose gift they'd turned down all those centuries earlier. That's Poseidon's whole relationship with disappointment distilled into a single contest. He doesn't lose quietly, and he doesn't lose briefly. He loses once, publicly, memorably, and then spends the rest of recorded history making absolutely certain nobody forgets that he lost. Now we come to one of the darkest stories in this whole family's history, and I want to tell it plainly, because softening it wouldn't do it justice, and it wouldn't do the woman at the center of it justice either. Medusa, before she was a monster, was a mortal woman, famous, by every account, for hair so beautiful it drew comparisons to spun gold, a priestess serving in Athene's own temple, sworn like so many of that goddess's attendants to a life of chastity in her service. She wanted nothing to do with the god who eventually found her there. Poseidon assaulted her inside that very temple. I'm not going to dress that up with softer language, because the old accounts don't dress it up either, and a story this old deserves the same honesty now that it demanded from anyone brave enough to tell it truthfully back then. He violated a sworn priestess in the goddess's own sacred space, and when Athene discovered what had happened within the walls of her own temple, her fury was total. But here's the injustice that's echoed for 3,000 years since, and it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Athene's rage didn't land on Poseidon, not even slightly. He was too powerful, too much her own uncle, too far above any consequence a goddess of wisdom and war could realistically hand down to a brother of Zeus. So her fury landed instead on Medusa, the victim, transformed on the spot into a monster so hideous that a single glance at her face would turn any living creature to stone. Her golden hair, the very thing so many stories say drew Poseidon's eye in the first place, became a writhing nest of serpents. Beauty punished into permanent horror, while the god responsible walked away from that temple entirely unmarked, entirely unpunished, and largely unmentioned in the story that followed. Medusa lived out the rest of her existence, banished to a distant, desolate shore, monstrous and feared, until a hero named Perseus, grandson of Zeus, as you heard in an earlier telling, arrived to take her head while she slept. Guided by nothing but her reflection in a borrowed shield, so he'd never have to look at her directly and risk the very curse she'd been given no say in receiving. And even in death, one final twist belonged to Poseidon, because Medusa had been pregnant with his own children at the moment Perseus struck. From her severed neck sprang two beings at once: Pegasus, the winged horse who'd go on to carry heroes across the sky for generations, and Chrysaor, a giant warrior who receives considerably less attention in the stories that followed but existed all the same, born from the same violent instant as his more famous sibling. It's worth pausing on the whole shape of what just happened before we move past it, because it captures something true about Poseidon that none of his more charming tales, the dolphin, the courtship, even his fury over losing Athens, quite managed to show you. He caused an enormous, permanent harm to a mortal woman inside a goddess's own temple and walked away from every consequence of it. The punishment fell on Medusa. The blame, across most of the tellings that survive, still tends to slide right past the god who actually earned it. That's not an accident of storytelling. That's simply how power worked in this family, generation after generation. The ones with the least of it paid for the choices made by the ones who had the most. There's a story that follows directly from that same wounded pride, and it's one of the darker turns in this whole family's history, because the person who paid for it wasn't a rival god at all. It was a mortal woman who never got a say in any of it. Medusa, before she was a monster, was a priestess, young, beautiful by every account, sworn to serve in one of Athene's own temples, living a life of quiet devotion that had nothing to do with gods squabbling over cities or spurned affection. Poseidon, still nursing whatever mixture of pride and appetite defined so much of his behavior toward mortal women, took an interest in her anyway and pursued her into the very temple she served in. What happened next, different tellings framed differently, some as an assault Medusa had no power to refuse, others softer and less honest about the imbalance of power actually at play. But every version agrees on the same essential fact: Poseidon had Medusa inside Athene's own sacred temple, defiling ground that belonged to another goddess entirely. Athene's fury, when she discovered the desecration, did not land on her uncle. It landed on Medusa. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's one of the ugliest patterns this whole family keeps repeating, generation after generation, story after story. A god commits the violation, and a mortal woman absorbs the punishment for it. Athene transformed Medusa on the spot, her beautiful hair twisted into living snakes, her gaze turned so monstrous that any living creature who looked directly at her face would turn instantly to stone. Exiled from any decent life she might have led, Medusa was driven out to a remote island, where she lived out the rest of her days as one of the most feared monsters in the entire mythology, hunted eventually by Perseus, who took her head while she slept and never had to look her directly in the eye to do it. Poseidon, who'd started the whole tragedy with a single act of pursuit inside a temple that wasn't his to violate, faced no consequence at all. Not from Athene, not from Zeus, not from anyone. He simply moved on, as he tended to, while the woman he'd pursued paid the entire cost of what happened between them for the rest of a life that was no longer recognizably her own. There is one small, strange postscript worth telling, because it's the only thing resembling an acknowledgement that Medusa's transformation came from somewhere real. When Perseus finally beheaded her, two things sprang from her severed neck at once, proof, right there in that single grim moment, of exactly what had happened to her all those years before. One was Chrysaor, a giant wielding a golden sword. The other was Pegasus, the winged horse, born fully formed from the same violent instant, offspring of Medusa and Poseidon both, finally emerging into the world only in the moment of their mother's death. Pegasus went on to have a long and celebrated life in this family's wider story, tamed eventually by the hero Bellerophon with a golden bridle gifted by Athene herself, carrying that same hero into battle against the monstrous Chimera and eventually earning a permanent place among the constellations. It's strange, and more than a little uncomfortable, to watch a story born from an assault produce a creature so beloved by nearly everyone who encounters him afterward. But that's this family's pattern too, laid bare one more time. The god responsible for the harm walks away clean, and the world simply finds a way to make something beautiful out of whatever's left behind. Here's a story that matters more than it looks like at first, because it plants a grudge that won't fully come due for generations, and when it finally does, it burns an entire city to the ground. At one point, for reasons the old accounts don't fully agree on, some say it was punishment for a plot against Zeus, others simply a period of servitude imposed on a handful of gods for reasons lost to time. Poseidon and Apollo found themselves working, quite literally, as lubcas for a mortal king. His name was Laomedon, ruler of Troy, generations before the war you already know so well, and the job he set his two divine workers to was substantial: build the walls of his city, tall and strong enough to withstand any siege that might ever come against it. Poseidon and Apollo did the work themselves, hands-on, raising walls so massive and so well constructed that they'd become legendary throughout the ancient world, the very walls, as it happens, that would hold off the combined might of the entire Greek army for 10 full years, centuries later, in the war that finally brought this city down. Poseidon, if you want the irony of it laid out plainly, personally built the fortification that made his own descendants' war against Troy so brutally difficult to win. When the work was finished, Laomedon refused to pay them. Not partially, not with some excuse about a bad harvest or an empty treasury. He simply looked at two of the most powerful gods in existence, who had just spent considerable effort building him the finest walls in the known world, and told them, in essence, to be grateful for the honor of having served him at all. Some tellings even have him threatening to sell them into slavery or cut off their ears if they pressed the matter any further. You already know, by this point in the night, exactly how well threats like that tend to land with this family. Apollo answered by sending a plague down onto the city. Poseidon answered with something worse, a sea monster, vast and merciless, that he sent to ravage the Trojan coastline, devouring livestock, wrecking ships, terrorizing the population until an oracle finally told Laomedon the only way to stop it was to offer up his own daughter, Hesione, chained to a rock by the shore as a sacrifice to the very creature Poseidon had unleashed. It took Heracles, passing through, as he so often did, right at the moment some kingdom needed rescuing, to kill the monster and free the girl, on the promise of a reward from Laomedon that, characteristically, the king then also refused to pay. Heracles, unlike two patient gods willing to let the insult simmer for a generation, came back almost immediately with an army and sacked the city outright, the very first fall of Troy, long before the more famous one you already know the ending of. But Poseidon's grudge against the city itself never fully cooled, even after that first destruction and its eventual rebuilding. When the Trojan War finally came, generations later, you already know which side he chose. He backed the Greeks fiercely, right alongside Hera and Athene, and while the popular telling of that war usually credits the Golden Apple and Paris's judgment as the whole cause of Poseidon's hostility toward Troy, there's an older, quieter grudge sitting underneath it too, a king who refused to pay two gods for an honest day's work, and a sea god who apparently never, not once in all the centuries between that betrayal and that final war, forgot exactly who owed him. That's Poseidon's memory for you, laid out across generations instead of years. Cross him once, even as a mortal king dead, and buried long before the real reckoning arrives, and the debt gets collected eventually, whether you're the one who owes it or simply the city unlucky enough to still be standing where he left it. If you are here for the telling of Odysseus's long road home, you already know this from the other side, but I promised you Poseidon's whole account tonight, so let's tell it properly. From the father's chair, this time instead of the victim's. Polyphemus, the one-eyed Cyclops who trapped Odysseus and his crew in that cave on the way home from Troy, wasn't just any monster. He was Poseidon's own son, born to a sea nymph named Thoosa, and whatever savagery he showed toward the men who wandered uninvited into his home, he was, to his father, exactly that, a son, deserving of the same protection and vengeance any of Poseidon's other children could expect. You already know what happened in that cave. Odysseus's cleverness, the wine, the false name, the burning stake driven into a single sleeping eye. What you may not have sat with quite as long is what it looked like from underwater, once Polyphemus, blind and humiliated, called out to his own father for justice, cursing the man who'd done this to him and begging Poseidon to make sure that man suffered before he ever saw home again. Poseidon heard every word of it, the same way Zeus hears every oath sworn in his name, and he did not treat the prayer lightly. His own child, blinded in his own home by a stranger who then had the audacity to shout his real name across the water as he sailed away, mocking the very monster he'd just crippled. You want to understand why Odysseus's 10-year voyage home turned into the single longest, cruelest journey in the whole of Greek myth? Understand this. It wasn't really about the blinding itself. Monsters get hurt by clever mortals all the time in this family's stories. It was the boasting afterward, the pride, the refusal to simply vanish into the night with his men and his freedom, that turned an ordinary act of self-defense into a personal insult a father couldn't simply let go. And Poseidon, as you've already gathered tonight if nothing else, does not let insults go. He spent the next decade making sure Odysseus's own journey mirrored, almost exactly, the punishment his son had prayed for: late, broken, alone, arriving home on a stranger's ship, having lost every man who ever sailed under his command. It's worth noting something here that doesn't always get said plainly enough in the telling of that particular story. Poseidon wasn't simply being cruel for cruelty's sake, not by his own accounting of it, anyway. He was being a father. A furious, disproportionate, decade-long avenging father, the same instinct that drives nearly every parent in this family's whole sprawling history to protect their own children against outside harm, whatever shape that protection ends up taking once it's fully unleashed. Zeus wept blood watching his own son die at Troy and did nothing, bound by fate to let it happen. Poseidon, given a fate that left him considerably more room to maneuver, used every inch of that room to make one clever mortal pay for what he'd done to a son nobody else in this whole family particularly loved, but who was, undeniably, his own. That's the other side of the story you already know the ending to. Not a monster in a cave from this angle. Just a father hearing his child scream for help across open water and answering with everything he had. Not every one of Poseidon's mortal children grew up to be a monster in a cave. Some grew up to be among the greatest heroes the ancient world ever produced, and Theseus's story is worth telling in full because it starts with one of the odder paternity arrangements in this whole family's history. King Aegeus of Athens, desperate for an heir and having consulted an oracle whose riddling answer he couldn't quite untangle, stopped for a night in the city of Troezen on his way home and stayed with a local princess named Aethra. That same night, by most tellings, two fathers claimed the same child, Aegeus, in the ordinary mortal sense, and Poseidon, who'd also come to Aethra that same night, either before or after her mortal visitor, depending on which storyteller you trust. The result was a boy raised with two possible fathers, and as it turned out, the strength and destiny of both. Aegeus, before leaving Trojan, hid a sword and a pair of sandals beneath an enormous boulder, and told Aethra that if the child born from that night turned out to be a son strong enough to move the stone on his own, she should send him to Athens to claim his birthright once he was grown. Years later, Theseus lifted that boulder without much trouble at all, retrieved the sword and sandals, and set off for Athens to find the father who'd left them waiting for him. He grew into one of the great monster-slaying heroes of the whole mythology along the way, clearing the dangerous road to Athens of bandits and beasts that had terrorized travelers for years. And once he arrived, and eventually proved his identity to Aegeus, he took on the labor that made him famous for good. Ending the tribute Athens had been forced to pay to Crete ever since Minos's war against the city, a tribute of youths and maidens sent regularly into the labyrinth to be devoured by the Minotaur. You've already heard, in an earlier telling, how that whole tangled mess came to exist, Poseidon's own bull, cursed onto Pasiphae by Poseidon's fury at Minos's broken sacrificial promise, producing the monster at the center of that maze in the first place. It's a strange thing to notice. If you're paying attention, Poseidon is the reason the Minotaur exists at all, and Poseidon may also, depending on which father you believe fathered him that night in Trojan, be the reason the hero who finally kills it exists too. One god, quietly responsible for both ends of the very same tragedy, generations apart, never quite acknowledging the connection out loud. Theseus slew the Minotaur, guided out of the labyrinth by Ariadne's thread, and went on to a long and celebrated career as one of Athens's great founding heroes, uniting the scattered towns of Attica into a single city-state, battling Amazons, descending briefly into the underworld itself on a reckless later adventure, and generally cementing himself as exactly the kind of hero a city likes to claim as its own founding figure. There's a darker postscript to his origin worth including, though, because it ties directly back to the sea god who may have fathered him in the first place. Poseidon, by some accounts, granted Theseus 3 wishes as a young man, a father's gift, whichever father you believe was speaking. Years later, deceived by a false accusation against his own son Hippolytus, a furious and grieving Theseus used one of those wishes to call down Poseidon's wrath on the boy he wrongly believed had betrayed him. Poseidon granted it without hesitation, sending a monstrous bull up from the sea to terrify Hippolytus's chariot horses, dragging the innocent young man to his death on the rocks below before the truth of his innocence ever had the chance to reach his father's ears. It's a bitter little postscript to an otherwise heroic story, and it's worth sitting with for exactly that reason. Poseidon's gifts, across this whole family's history, tend to come with teeth in them somewhere. Even a wish granted out of genuine paternal generosity ended up, decades later, killing an innocent grandson who never did anything to deserve it. Proof that this particular god's power, once set loose, has never once shown much interest in double-checking whether the person on the receiving end of it actually had it coming. There's a piece of Theseus's own journey to Athens worth adding here, before we move on, because several of the monsters and bandits he cleared from that dangerous road turn out to be more of Poseidon's own children, proof that this particular god's bloodline produced heroes and horrors in roughly equal measure, sometimes within the very same generation. Sion was one of them, a bandit who made his home on a narrow cliffside path along the road to Athens, and his particular cruelty had a strange, almost ritualistic shape to it. He forced travelers to wash his feet at the cliff's edge, and the moment they knelt to do it, he kicked them off the rocks into the sea below, where, according to the old account, a giant turtle waited to devour whatever remained of them once they hit the water. Theseus, presented with the same demand, simply seized Sion by the ankles and threw him off his own cliff instead, letting the very turtle that had feasted on so many previous travelers finish the job on the man who'd fed it for years. Procrustes was another, and his particular horror has lent an entire phrase to modern language, even for people who have never heard his name. He kept an iron bed at his home along the roadside and offered weary travelers a place to rest, except the bed, it turned out, had to fit its occupant exactly. Guests too short for the frame were stretched on a rack until they matched its length. Guests too tall had their legs hacked off until they fit. Theseus, once again refusing to be the next name added to a long list of victims, forced Procrustes onto his own bed and gave him precisely the same treatment he'd inflicted on everyone else, ending the horror the same way he'd ended Scion's, with poetic, exact reciprocity. It's worth noticing that not every source names Poseidon as the father of these two particular monsters. The old accounts disagree, the way they so often do, and some tellings leave Scion and Procrustes without any divine parentage at all, simply cruel men doing cruel things on a dangerous road. But enough of the old sources do trace this particular strain of casual, almost recreational violence back to the sea god's bloodline that it's worth including here, because it fits a pattern you've already seen play out again and again tonight. Poseidon's children ranged from Theseus, genuinely heroic, to Polyphemus, monstrous mostly through circumstance and a very understandable rage at strangers raiding his home, all the way down to men like these, cruelty for its own sake, dressed up as hospitality, waiting patiently by the roadside for exactly the wrong traveler to wander past. Theseus cleared that whole road of monsters before he ever reached the city that would come to claim him as its own founding hero, and it's a small, satisfying irony that so many of the horrors he defeated along the way carried the very same bloodline he himself may have carried, by at least one father's account. Whatever inheritance Poseidon actually passed down through his children, it clearly wasn't destiny. Some of his sons built cities. Others simply waited by the road for someone smaller than themselves to come walking past. The god was the same every single time. What his children chose to do with that inheritance, once they were grown, always seems to have been entirely up to them. Let's move through a few more of Poseidon's children now, because between them, they tell you almost everything else worth knowing about the range of what this god was capable of fathering, from the gentlest of gifts to the most monstrous of grudges, sometimes within the very same story. Orion was a giant, a hunter of legendary skill, and by most accounts, Poseidon's own son, gifted by his father with the strange and useful ability to walk across the surface of the sea as easily as any mortal walks across dry land. He grew into one of the great hunters of the ancient world, companion for a time to Artemis herself, who respected his skill enough to hunt alongside him, until his own boasting, in a pattern this whole family's stories seem to repeat endlessly, got the better of him. He claimed at one point that he could kill every animal on Earth, a boast that offended Gaia deeply enough that she sent a scorpion to kill him in response. Or, in other tellings, that Artemis herself, tricked by her jealous brother Apollo into believing a distant figure on the horizon was an enemy rather than her own hunting companion, shot Orion dead without realizing her mistake until it was already too late to undo. Either way, Orion died, and Poseidon, along with the rest of the grieving gods, placed him among the stars, the constellation that still bears his name, sword at his belt, visible across the whole world every winter, a hunter forever chasing something he'll never quite catch. Antaeus tells a very different kind of story, and it's one of the more monstrous entries on this particular list. Son of Poseidon and Gaia, both sea and earth combined into a single towering giant, Antaeus ruled a stretch of North African desert and made a habit of challenging every traveler who passed through to a wrestling match, a contest that always ended the same way, Antaeus crushing his opponent to death, then using their skulls to build a temple to his own father, a grim architectural tribute that had apparently been growing for years by the time Heracles wandered through on one of his own labors. Antaeus's secret strength came from his mother. So long as he stayed in contact with the earth, Gaia's own power flowed up into him constantly, renewing his strength every time he touched the ground, making him functionally impossible to wear down or overpower in any ordinary fight. Heracles, quicker to notice the pattern than most of Antaeus's previous victims had apparently been, simply lifted the giant clean off the ground and crushed him midair, cutting him off from his mother's power long enough to finish the job before Antaeus's strength could ever renew itself again. It's a monstrous little footnote to Poseidon's family tree, and worth including precisely because it shows you the darker end of what this god's bloodline could produce when the mortal half of the equation went unchecked. Not every child of a god turns out heroic. Some of them just turn out enormous, cruel, and eventually, inevitably, someone else's problem to solve. And then there's Keneus, whose story is stranger and gentler than either of the last two, and worth ending on for exactly that reason. Born Kenes, a young woman assaulted by Poseidon in a moment the old accounts don't shy away from calling exactly what it was, she was granted, afterward, a single wish by the god responsible, and rather than ask for gold or vengeance or any of the more predictable requests this family's stories tend to produce, Kenes asked to be transformed into a man, invulnerable to any weapon, so that what had happened to her could never happen to her again. Poseidon granted it. Kenes became Keneus, grew into one of the great warriors of that generation, fought in some of the most famous battles of the era, and by most accounts lived out a full and celebrated life in that new form, honored among the other heroes of his time, without ever needing to explain the reason behind the transformation to anyone who hadn't already heard the story. It's a small, strange mercy tucked into a night otherwise full of Poseidon taking without asking. For once, faced with a request born directly out of his own violation, he actually granted exactly what was asked of him. No trick, no hidden cost, no cruelty buried in the fine print. Given how rarely that happens across the rest of tonight's telling, I think it's worth noticing when it finally does. There's one more pursuit worth telling before Tyro's story, and it's a strange one, because the woman running from Poseidon this time wasn't a nymph or a mortal princess. She was his own sister. Demeter, in the depths of her grief and rage over losing Persephone to the underworld, the very story you've already heard from an earlier telling, was wandering the earth, disguised and inconsolable, wanting nothing to do with any god or mortal while she searched. Poseidon, spotting her in that vulnerable, wandering state, decided he wanted her anyway, grief or no grief, and pursued her the same way he'd pursued so many others across this whole family's history. Demeter, desperate to escape him, transformed herself into a mare and hid among a mortal king's grazing herd, hopping to lose herself among ordinary horses long enough for her brother to give up the chase. Poseidon simply transformed himself into a stallion and found her anyway, and what followed produced two children born from that strange double disguise, a daughter whose true name was considered too sacred to speak aloud in the old mystery cults built around her mother's worship, and a son named Arion, a horse himself, wild and immortal, gifted with the power of human speech, and a speed no mortal horse could ever hope to match. Arion went on to a long and storied career, carrying heroes across battlefields no ordinary animal could have survived, eventually passing into the hands of Heracles and later the doomed hero Adrastus, the sole survivor of a disastrous assault on Thebes. Saved from certain death only because the horse he happened to be riding could outrun literally anything else alive. It's an uncomfortable story to tell plainly, and I won't pretend otherwise. A god passing his own grieving sister through disguise after disguise until she had nowhere left to hide, is not a moment this family's mythology asks you to admire. But it sits here anyway, one more entry in a very long list, because leaving it out would be its own kind of dishonesty about who this god actually was, even toward the members of his own family who wanted nothing to do with him. There's a story I've been saving, because it ties Poseidon directly into the bloodline that produced the two brothers who led the entire Greek army to Troy. And it starts, unusually for this god, with genuine tenderness rather than pursuit. Pelops was a young prince, son of a mortal king named Tantalus, and if that name sounds familiar, it should, because this is the very same Tantalus who once tried to test the god's omniscience by killing his own son and serving him at a feast, the same king condemned afterward to stand eternally in a pool of water and beneath a tree of fruit, both forever out of reach. Pelops was that son. Restored to life by the gods once his father's crime came to light, rebuilt whole from whatever remained of him, except for one shoulder, accidentally consumed by a grieving Demeter before anyone realized what was on the plate. The gods replaced it with ivory, and Pelops grew into a young man carrying, quite literally, a permanent mark of the horror his own family had put him through. Poseidon, watching this restored young prince grow up, fell for him the same way he'd fallen for so many others across this whole family's history. But where Zeus swept Ganymede away by force in the shape of an eagle, Poseidon's love for Pelops, by most tellings, came without deception or abduction at all. He simply took the boy up to Olympus himself, openly, taught him to drive a chariot with a skill no mortal charioteer could match. And when the time came for Pelops to return to the world of men and make his own way, sent him back down with gifts that would prove decisive in the single defining trial of his young life. That trial waited for him at the court of King Unamus, ruler of Pisa, whose daughter Hypodermia was, by every account, one of the most sought-after brides in the whole of Greece. Unamus, though driven either by an unhealthy attachment to his own daughter or by a prophecy warning that his son-in-law would one day kill him, depending on which telling you trust, had a rather brutal method of screening suitors. Any man who wished to marry Hypodermia first had to defeat Unamus in a chariot race, with Hypodermia riding alongside the suitor as a distraction, and the king's own horses, sired by the wind god himself, unbeatable by any ordinary team. Losing suitors didn't simply go home disappointed. Unamus killed every one of them, and by the time Pelops arrived, the heads of a dozen previous challengers were already nailed above the palace gates as a grim warning to the next hopeful in line. Pelops, with Poseidon's own winged chariot and swift immortal horses at his command, a gift from the god who'd raised him, stood a genuine chance where a dozen other men hadn't. But he took no risks with the odds regardless. He bribed Unamus's own charioteer, a man named Myrtilus, promising him half the kingdom, or by some tellings a night with Hypodermia herself, in exchange for sabotaging the king's chariot before the race even began. Myrtilus replaced the bronze linchpins holding the wheels in place with pins made of wax, and during the race itself, the wheels came loose, the chariot collapsed, and Unamus, dragged and entangled in his own reins, was killed exactly the way the old prophecy had warned he might be. Pelops won his bride. He also, immediately afterward, refused to pay Myrtilus what he'd promised, and in most tellings, threw the charioteer off a cliff into the sea rather than honor the bargain that had won him the race in the first place. Myrtilus, dying, cursed Pelops and his entire bloodline with his final breath, a curse that would echo down through generations of that family with a thoroughness that makes even Cronus's own paranoid prophecy look almost gentle by comparison. Because Pelops's sons were Atreus and Thyestes, whose own rivalry and betrayal, a stolen throne, a wife seduced, children murdered, and served at a feast in an echo of Pelops's own father's crime a generation earlier, poisoned that family for another full generation. And Atreus's own son, inheriting a throne built on a rugged race and a broken promise, and cursed by a dying man thrown into the sea, was Agamemnon, commander of the entire Greek fleet at Troy, murdered in his own bath the moment he finally returned home victorious from that war. It's worth sitting with the shape of that whole inheritance, because Poseidon sits at the very root of it, however gently his own part in the story began. He loved a broken young prince, raised him, gifted him the very horses and chariot that let him win an impossible race. And in doing exactly that, in giving Pelops the tools to cheat his way to victory rather than simply lose Unarubla to unbeatable horses, he set in motion a curse that would eventually consume 3 generations of the most powerful family in the whole Greek world, ending only when Agamemnon's own children finally broke the cycle generations later. In stories still being told long after the war at Troy had already passed into legend. That's Poseidon's fingerprint on the house of Atreus, laid out plainly, not malice this time, not pursuit, not violation. Just a gift, given out of real affection, that happened to hand a desperate young man exactly the means to win by cheating rather than by trying his luck honestly, and a family curse doesn't much care whether the god who started it meant well or not. It just keeps compounding, generation after generation, until somebody finally pays the whole debt off in full. Every queen in this family eventually gets her own story of jealousy, and Amphitrite, gentle as her courtship was, turns out to be no exception, though her one great act of fury, when it finally comes, lands on a young woman who never did anything except catch the wrong god's eye at the wrong moment. The same tragic pattern you've already heard play out so many times through Hera's own long history of grudges. Scylla, before she became the 6-headed horror that would one day help doom 6 of Odysseus's men in that narrow strait beside Charybdis, was simply a beautiful sea nymph, spending her days bathing in a quiet cove along the coast. Poseidon, by some tellings, took an interest in her the way he took an interest in so many others, and Amphitrite, discovering the attention her husband had been paying to yet another young nymph, did not confront Poseidon directly. She did what queens in this family so often do instead. She went after the woman who had never asked for any of it in the first place. Amphitrite poisoned the waters of Scylla's Favcrata bathing cove with certain dark herbs, and the next time the young nymph waded in for her usual swim, her lower body twisted and transformed before she even understood what was happening to her, legs fusing into a writhing mass of serpents and ravenous dog heads. Her once lovely form warped permanently into something so monstrous that she fled from her own reflection and took up residence in a cave overlooking the narrowest, most dangerous strait in the entire sea, unable to ever return to the life or the body she'd had before that single, unlucky afternoon. There's another telling of this same transformation that lays the blame elsewhere entirely. The sorceress Circe, jealous over her own unrequited feelings for a minor sea god named Glaucus, who loved Scylla instead, cursing the young nymph out of her own wounded pride rather than Amphitrite's. The old sources don't agree, and I won't pretend they do. But I think it's worth telling Amphitrite's version here anyway, alongside everything else you've heard tonight, because it completes something important about this whole family's pattern that would otherwise stay conveniently unfinished. Zeus wanders, and Hera punishes the women. Poseidon wanders, by most tellings just as often, and here, at least once, Amphitrite did exactly the same thing her sister-in-law had been doing for centuries. It's a small, uncomfortable symmetry, and I think it matters precisely because it's so easy to let Amphitrite's story end with nothing but a dolphin and a gentle courtship, an exception to the rule the rest of this family seems built on. Maybe she was gentler than Hera most days, across most of this long telling, but given the exact same provocation, a husband's wandering eye, landing on a woman with no power to refuse him, she reached. At least this once, for the very same cruelty. That's not a flattering thing to add to her story, but it's an honest one, And by now, I hope you've noticed that honesty has been the whole point of telling it this way all along. And Scylla, transformed and trapped in that cave for the rest of her monstrous life, ended up costing Odysseus's crew 6 men on their own long voyage home, men who had nothing whatsoever to do with the argument that made her a monster in the first place, paying, generations later, for a jealousy that had nothing to do with them at all. That's how these curses tend to work in this family, when you trace them all the way to their source. The grudge starts small and personal and furious. And by the time it's finished collecting its full price, the people actually paying it are almost never the ones who caused it. Let's talk about Tyro for a moment, because her story shows you Poseidon operating in the exact same register Zeus favored so often in his own catalogue: disguise, deception, and a bloodline set in motion without the mother's genuine consent ever quite entering into it. Tyro was a mortal princess, hopelessly in love with a river god named Olympus, who wanted absolutely nothing to do with her. Poseidon, noticing her devotion to a rival god who couldn't be bothered to return it, decided the simplest solution was to become that river god himself, taking Olympus's exact shape, down to the last detail, and approaching Tyro disguised as the very man she'd been pinning after. She had no way of knowing the difference. By the time she understood what had actually happened, she was already pregnant with twins. Those twins, Peleus and Nullas, grew up to found 2 of the more significant royal houses in the whole of Greek myth. Peleus became king of Ulcas, the very kingdom whose throne he'd later refused to hand back to its rightful heir, Jason, unless the young man could first retrieve the Golden Fleece. The whole reason the Argonauts' famous voyage happened at all traces back, several generations removed, to a river god's disguise and a princess who never got to choose who she was actually sleeping with. Nullas, meanwhile, founded the kingdom of Peleus, whose own royal line would eventually produce Nestor, the wise old consulk, who advised the Greek forces throughout the entire Trojan War and lived long enough afterward to receive Telemachus himself, still searching for news of his missing father Odysseus. It's the same pattern you've heard from Zeus's side of this family over and over. A god's disguised pursuit of a mortal woman, unknown to her at the time, ends up seeding an entire royal lineage that shapes the wider mythology for generations afterward. Poseidon wasn't simply fathering isolated children scattered across isolated stories. He was building kingdoms, the same way his brother was, using exactly the same methods, with exactly the same disregard for whether the women involved had any real say in the matter. You already met Peleus briefly, born of that disguised river god deception played on Tyro, one of the twin sons who went on to found their own royal houses. His own story deserves a little more room, because it's the reason the most famous sea voyage in the whole of Greek myth, outside of Odysseus's own long road home, ever happened at all. Peleus grew up to seize the throne of Ulcas from his own half-brother, Uson, and ruled there uneasily for years, haunted by a prophecy warning him to beware a man wearing only one sandal. That man arrived eventually, grown and unaware of the prophecy himself. Jason, Uson's own son, raised in hiding and returning as a young man to reclaim the throne that should rightfully have been his, having lost one sandal fording a river on his way into the city. Peleus, recognizing the very sign he'd been dreading, didn't refuse Jason outright. He set him a task instead, the same way kings in this whole family's stories so often do when they'd rather engineer someone's death than risk an open confrontation. Bring back the Golden Fleece, a treasure guarded by a dragon that never slept, kept in a distant kingdom at the very edge of the known world, and the throne would be his. It was, as far as Peleus was concerned, a polite way of arranging for a young rival to die a very long way from home. Jason, however, assembled a crew of the greatest heroes of that generation, the Argonauts, named for their ship, the Argo, and against every reasonable expectation, actually succeeded, returning with the fleece, and more consequentially for Peleus, with the sorceress Medea at his side. Peleus, naturally, refused to honor his own end of the bargain once Jason returned triumphant. And Medea, whose particular skill for vengeance would go on to define several of the darkest chapters in this whole saga's later history, arranged Peleus's death through a trick almost too cruel to be called clever, convincing his own daughters that she could restore their aging father's youth by cutting him into pieces and boiling him in a magic cauldron, having first demonstrated the trick successfully on an ordinary old ram. The daughters, believing wholeheartedly in a miracle they just watched performed in front of their own eyes, did exactly as she instructed to their own father, and Peleus, unlike the ram, never came back out of that cauldron at all. It's worth pausing on where all of this actually started, because it traces back, patiently, to a single afternoon centuries earlier, when Poseidon disguised himself as a river god to seduce a princess pinning after someone who wanted nothing to do with her. That deception produced Peleus. Peleus's own fear of a professored one-sandaled rival produced the entire voyage of the Argo. And that voyage produced Medea, whose particular genius for vengeance would eventually claim not only Peleus himself, but, in a much darker chapter still to come in her own story, several people who deserved that fate far less than the king who'd started the whole chain of events by refusing to hand back a throne that was never rightfully his in the first place. Poseidon, once the deception in Tyro's story was finished and the twins were born, doesn't reappear directly anywhere in this particular chain of consequences. He simply set the first domino falling generations earlier and then let it run, the same pattern you've heard again and again tonight, whether the god in question is Poseidon or his brother. These gods rarely stick around to watch the consequences of their own wandering attention play out to the end. They just move on to the next coastline, the next disguise, the next quiet spring waiting to be struck up out of dry ground, and leave the bloodlines they've started to work out the rest of the story on their own, however many generations it eventually takes. There's a shorter, uglier story worth setting beside it, involving a woman named Amamun, one of the 50 daughters of a mortal king named Denus, descended, as it happens, from that very same bloodline of Io's son Epiphus you heard about in an earlier telling, the thread that ran from a cow transformed back into a woman all the way down to Argos itself. Amamun, sent out to search for water during a terrible drought, was nearly assaulted by a satyr in the wilderness, and Poseidon, arriving in time to drive the satyr off, saved her from that immediate danger, only to claim the exact same thing for himself moments later. He did leave her with something practical, at least, in exchange, striking the ground with his trident at the spot where the encounter took place, and bringing forth a spring that would supply the drought-stricken region of Argos with water for generations afterward, still known by her name centuries later. It's a bitter kind of gift when you sit with it plainly. A god saves a woman from one violation only to commit a version of it himself, and the story remembers the water he left behind more fondly across the centuries than it ever seems to remember what actually happened to her to produce it. That's a pattern worth naming honestly, because it repeats often enough across this whole family's history that pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. Poseidon's gifts to the world, springs, horses, safe harbors, favored winds, sit right alongside a very long list of women who paid for those gifts in ways the old stories rarely bothered to linger on for very long before moving on to the next kingdom, the next bloodline, the next quiet spring bearing someone's forgotten name. You already know from an earlier telling how Poseidon's grudge against Laomedon's broken promise carried down through the generations into open hostility toward Troy itself. When the war finally came, he backed the Greeks without hesitation, right alongside Hera and Athene, and threw himself into that conflict with a directness that occasionally put him at odds with his own brother's careful attempts to keep the gods from tipping the war too far in either direction. You've already heard, too, about the afternoon Hera borrowed Aphrodite's girdle and lulled Zeus to sleep in a golden cloud specifically so that Poseidon could surge onto the battlefield unsupervised, rallying the Greek forces and turning the tide of the entire war during the one window his brother wasn't watching closely enough to stop him. That's Poseidon's temperament laid bare in a single scene. Given an unsupervised hour, he didn't hesitate for a second before using every bit of it. There's a gentler side to his involvement in that war worth knowing too, though, because for all his fury toward Troy as a city, he wasn't without a sense of fairness toward individual mortals who'd never personally wronged him. At one point in the fighting, the Trojan hero Aeneas, son of Aphrodite, fated by the deepest threads of prophecy to survive the war and found a new lineage far from the ruins of his own city, found himself about to be killed by the Greek champion Achilles, in a duel that, by the ordinary shape of that war, he had no real chance of surviving. Poseidon, despite backing the Greeks in nearly everything else, intervened directly to save him. He didn't do it out of any particular love for Aeneas himself, and the old accounts are honest about the real reason. Aeneas was fated to survive, to carry a piece of Troy's royal bloodline forward into a future far beyond that burning city, and Poseidon, whatever grudges he carried against Troy's kings, respected the deeper architecture of fate enough not to let a temporary battlefield outcome unravel a destiny the threads had already spun. He shrouded Aeneas in mist, pulled him bodily from the fight, and set him down safely away from Achilles' spear before returning to the rest of the battle and resuming his usual enthusiastic support for the very side that had just lost its intended kill. It's a strange little moment of restraint from a god who rarely showed much of it elsewhere, and I think it's worth including precisely for that reason. Poseidon's fury ran deep and it ran long, as you've heard again and again tonight. But even he, when the deeper order of fate was genuinely at stake, knew where the line sat and stepped back from crossing it. His brother wept blood watching a son die rather than break that same order for personal grief. Poseidon, given a smaller, easier chance to bend fate slightly in a mortal's favor, took it, and then made sure the mortal in question survived to do exactly what he was destined to do, whether that suited Poseidon's own wounded pride toward Troy or not. That's about as close as this particular god gets to nuance across this whole family's long and difficult history. Not mercy exactly, more like respect for a structure even he understood was bigger than his own grudges. You've already heard, from an earlier telling, how Gaia raised an army of giants to avenge the Titans, and how that war required a mortal hero fighting alongside the gods before it could finally be won. What that telling didn't dwell on was Poseidon's own part in the fighting, and it's worth setting down properly here because it shows you exactly how a sea god wages war on dry land by making sure the land doesn't stay dry for very long. Among the giants Gaia sent against Olympus was one named Polybotes, enormous and vicious even by the standards of his own kind, and when the fighting reached its worst, Poseidon pursued him not across a battlefield in the ordinary sense, but across the open sea itself, chasing the giant with a fury that mirrored, in miniature, exactly the temper you've already heard about tonight in the story of Athens and that lost contest with his niece. He drove Polybotes all the way to the island of Kos, and when the giant refused to fall even there, Poseidon did something that only a god who literally ruled the crust of the earth could manage. He broke off an entire piece of the island itself and hurled it down on top of the giant, burying him beneath the newly formed islet of Nisiros, which still sits in that same stretch of sea to this day, a landmass that exists, according to the old accounts, purely because a god needed a weapon heavier than anything he could otherwise get his hands on, and simply reached for the nearest island instead. It's worth pausing on that image, because it tells you something essential about the difference between how the three brothers fought that war. Zeus threw thunderbolts. Hades, staying mostly out of sight the way he always did, contributed his helm of invisibility to sneak Olympian fighters past giant sentries. Poseidon didn't need a weapon forged by anyone else at all. He simply picked up a piece of the world and dropped it on his enemy, the same casual, overwhelming application of force that defined nearly every other confrontation you've heard about tonight, whether the target was a rival god, an unfaithful mortal, or, on that particular afternoon, a giant too stubborn to know when he'd already lost. The Gigantomachy ended, as you already know, with Gaia's army broken and scattered beneath mountains and islands across the known world. One more layer of buried enemy joining the Titans in Tartarus and Typhon under Etna. Poseidon's own contribution to that scattered landscape of imprisoned monsters sits quietly in the Aegean Sea to this day, a small island most sailors passing it now have no reason to connect to anything more dramatic than ordinary geography, proof that even the most violent chapters of this whole family's history have a way of eventually settling into something as unremarkable and permanent as a dot on a map. You've already heard, from an earlier telling, how Zeus decided to wipe out nearly the whole of humanity with a flood, disgusted by what the species had become after Lycaon's monstrous dinner party. What I didn't tell you then is that Zeus didn't carry out that flood alone. He couldn't have. Rain falling from the sky is one thing. Water rising fast enough and high enough to drown the entire known world requires the cooperation of the one God who actually controls where all that water goes once it lands. Poseidon opened the sea itself for that flood, letting the ocean surge up over every coastline, every river valley, every low-lying plain across the whole of the ancient world, working in concert with his brother's rain to accomplish in days what neither god could have managed quite so completely alone. Between the two of them, nearly every trace of humanity simply vanished beneath the water, and only Deucalion and Pyrrha, warned in advance by Prometheus and set adrift in their small ark, survived to eventually repopulate the world once the waters finally receded. It's worth pausing on the logistics of that flood for a moment, because it tells you something about how completely this family's power depended on cooperation, even at its most destructive. Zeus could darken the sky and open the heavens, but the actual drowning, the part that mattered most, belonged to his brother. Every catastrophic flood across this whole family's history, in the end, runs through Poseidon's hands, whether the telling bothers to credit him by name or simply assumes his involvement as a matter of course. There's a gentler thread woven into that same story worth telling before we move on, and it involves the animal that became, across the ancient world, Poseidon's favorite living symbol. Dolphins, sailors believed, were sacred to him, intelligent, playful, genuinely fond of human company in a way most sea creatures weren't, appearing alongside ships in calm weather as a kind of blessing, a sign that the god ruling the waters below had, for the moment at least, decided to be friendly rather than furious. You've already heard how one particular dolphin won Poseidon his own bride, coaxing Amphitrite back from the edge of the world with nothing sharper than patience. Sailors carried that story with them across every voyage afterward, treating any dolphin that swam alongside their ship as a small, living reassurance that the crossing ahead might go smoothly after all. There's an uglier version of that same reverence worth knowing too, though, because Poseidon's temper never stayed dormant for long across this whole family's history. The story goes that a group of Tyrrhenian pirates once captured the young god Dionysus, not recognizing him for who he actually was, intending to sell him into slavery. Dionysus, once his true nature became clear, transformed the ship's mast into a living vine and filled the deck with wild beasts, and the terrified pirates leapt overboard rather than face what their ship had become. Poseidon, watching from below, took pity on the fleeing sailors rather than letting them simply drown, and transformed every one of them into dolphins instead, cursed, in a sense, to spend eternity as the very animal sacred to the god who just saved their lives, playful and harmless now, atonement for a crime against a god they hadn't recognized in time. It's a fitting little coda to Poseidon's relationship with the sea he ruled. Even his mercy tends to come wrapped in transformation, in consequence, in a permanent reminder of exactly what happens when you cross a line in his territory without realizing, until it's already too late, exactly whose water you were sailing on. There's one more story left to tell before we get to the end of Poseidon's reign, and it's a strange one, because unlike nearly everything else you've heard tonight, it doesn't come from the old poets who first sang of Troy and the Titans. It comes from a philosopher, centuries later, who used Poseidon's name to build the most famous lost city in the entire history of human imagination. According to Plato, writing long after the age of Homer had already passed, there was once an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond the strait that separates the Mediterranean from the vast unknown ocean stretching out toward the edge of the world, larger than Libya and Asia combined, and it belonged, from its very founding, to Poseidon. The story goes that Poseidon fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito, living alone on that island with no other company, and to protect her from any intrusion, he encircled her home with a series of concentric rings, alternating water and land, walls within walls within walls. A fortress built entirely out of the same sea he ruled everything else with. Cleito bore him 10 sons, and Poseidon divided the island among them, giving each a portion of the kingdom to rule, with the eldest, Atlas, not the Titan holding up the sky, a different Atlas entirely, though the shared name is no accident, set above the rest, as High King over the whole magnificent island. Atlantis, they called it in his honor. And under Poseidon's own descendants, it grew into the most advanced and prosperous civilization the world had ever seen, canals and bridges connecting the concentric rings of land and water, temples plated in gold and silver, and a strange, gleaming metal called orichalcum that shone like fire, a navy powerful enough to have once, according to Plato's account, nearly conquered the entire Mediterranean before an alliance of ancient Athenians finally turned them back. But power like that, in this family's stories, never stays humble for long. Atlantis grew wealthy, and then arrogant, and then, in the account Plato gives us, corrupt enough that the divine portion of its bloodline, the very inheritance Poseidon had given his own descendants, thinned out generation after generation until what remained on the throne was ambition without any of the wisdom that should have come attached to it. The gods, disgusted by what the island had become, judged it, and the punishment came from the same source as the island's original blessing. In a single day and night of catastrophe, the sea that Poseidon had once shaped into a fortress of protective rings around his beloved rose up instead, and swallowed the entire island whole, sinking Atlantis beneath the waves so completely and so permanently that not even its exact location survived into later memory. It's worth being honest about what this actually is, because it's different in kind from everything else you've heard tonight. Atlantis isn't part of the older, inherited tradition the way Troy and the Titans are. Plato most likely invented it himself, centuries after the classical age of gods and heroes had already passed its peak, using Poseidon's name and his established character, the builder, the destroyer, the god whose gifts and punishments both arrive by water, to tell a philosophical parable about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the fragility of even the most advanced civilization. But invented or not, it's become, over the centuries since, one of the most enduring stories ever attached to this god's name, proof that even after the temples closed and the old worship faded, Poseidon's particular signature, a paradise built by the sea and destroyed by the very same water, was compelling enough to outlive the religion that first gave him a trident and a throne. Sometimes the most lasting stories aren't the oldest ones. They're just the ones that understood the character well enough to know exactly how he'd end things, given the chance. You already know how badly Poseidon took his loss to Athene over Athens, and how that salt spring stayed on the Acropolis for centuries as a permanent reminder of the contest. What you haven't heard yet is that the grudge didn't stay confined to flooding a plain in a single fit of temper right after the vote. Generations later, it found a much more personal target, and it cost an Athenian king his life. Erechtheus was a mythical king of Athens, honored enough in the city's own founding stories that Athene herself was said to have raised him, and his reign became entangled in a war against a neighboring people called the Eleusinians, whose own forces, as it happened, were led by a son of Poseidon named Eumolpus. An oracle told Erechtheus that Athens could only win the coming war if he sacrificed one of his own daughters. He did, and by some accounts, his other daughters, bound by a shared oath among themselves, chose to die alongside her rather than live on without their sister, a grim, devoted act that secured Athens its victory and cost the king nearly his entire family in the process. Eumolpus fell in that same battle, and Poseidon, already carrying a grudge against this city that had never fully cooled since the day it chose an olive tree over his own saltwater spring, was not inclined to let his own son's death pass without an answer. He went to Zeus and demanded justice, and Zeus, weighing the matter, granted him leave to strike Erechtheus down directly. Poseidon didn't hesitate. He drove his trident into the earth at the king's feet, and the ground opened and swallowed Erechtheus whole, killing the very ruler whose family had just paid such a devastating price to win the war his own son had died fighting. It's a bitterly symmetrical little story if you sit with it for a moment. A city that once chose Athene's gift over Poseidon's still lost a king to that same god's fury, generations after the original contest had supposedly been settled once and for all. And it tells you something important about how differently these two rivals actually handled defeat and loss across this whole family's history. Athene, having won the city fairly, went on to protect and favor it for centuries, patient and largely benevolent toward the people who'd chosen her. Poseidon, having lost fairly by the same city's own honest vote, never once let the debt fully rest, striking at a plain here, a king there, across a span of time that must have felt, to the mortals living through each new disaster, like nothing more than ordinary bad luck, never quite connecting one god's ancient wounded pride to the specific catastrophe currently unfolding in front of them. Athens, for its part, never stopped hedging its bets. Long after Erechtheus fell, the city kept a temple on the Acropolis, the Erechtheion, named for the very king Poseidon had killed, that honored both Athene and Poseidon together under the same roof, side by side, the salt spring and the sacred olive tree practically within reach of each other. Call it wisdom or call it simple, well-earned fear. Either way, 3,000 years on, that temple still stands as the clearest proof in the whole city that even the gods who lose gracefully in public sometimes need to be quietly, permanently appeased in private. There's a shorter story worth telling here, because it shows you Poseidon not as the one meting out judgment for once, but as the grieving father standing on the other side of somebody else's court, and it happens to explain the origin of one of the most important legal institutions in the whole ancient Greek world. Poseidon had a son named Halorotheus, and by most accounts, not a particularly admirable one. He assaulted Alcip, a daughter of Ares, the god of war, in an act of violence that Ares, upon discovering it, answered the way you'd expect a god of war to answer. He killed Halorotheus on the spot. No trial, no deliberation, simple and immediate retribution for what had been done to his daughter. Poseidon, grieving his son's death regardless of what that son had done to deserve it, brought a formal complaint against Ares before the assembled gods, the first murder trial in the whole of Greek mythology, held on a rocky hill in Athens that would come to be known, from that day forward, as the Areopagus, the hill of Ares, in honor of the god who stood trial there. Ares was acquitted. The gods who sat in judgment agreed that killing a man who had assaulted your own daughter counted as justified retribution rather than unlawful murder, and Ares walked free, while Poseidon was left to accept a verdict that found no fault at all in the death of his own son. It's a strange story to include, because it doesn't show you Poseidon at his most powerful or his most furious. It shows you a father losing, formally and publicly, in front of the very court his own grief had helped establish. And it matters beyond just this one family's drama, because that same hill, the Areopagus, went on to become the actual seat of one of ancient Athens's real judicial councils, hearing real murder trials for real mortal citizens for centuries afterward, a piece of actual Athenian civic life that traced its own founding myth back to one god's dead son, another god's grieving fury, and a verdict that didn't go the way the aggrieved father wanted it to. Even a sea god who could crack the earth in half with a single strike of his trident, it turns out, wasn't above losing a court case. He just happened to be the one who accidentally founded the courtroom in the process of losing it. Zeus had Olympia, and the games held there every 4 years in his honor, the whole of Greece setting down its wars for the length of a single sacred truce. Poseidon had his own version of that same honor, held at the narrow isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to the rest of mainland Greece, and if you've ever wondered where the word isthmus gets its geographic weight from, you're standing, in a sense, on the very ground these games were named for. The Isthmian Games, held near Corinth every 2 years rather than 4, drew athletes and spectators from across the whole Greek world, competing in Poseidon's honor with the same intensity and very nearly the same prestige as the games held for his brother. Pine wreaths crowned the victors there, rather than the olive branches Zeus's own champions wore at Olympia, a fitting distinction, if you think about it, evergreen and coastal, exactly the kind of tree that thrives in the salt, ere a sea god's own sanctuary would naturally be built beside. Every coastal city in the Greek world kept temples in his honor, and every sailor, before setting out on any voyage of real consequence, made some offering at his altar, a bull sacrificed at the shoreline, a libation poured directly into the waves, small tokens of respect paid to a landlord powerful enough to end a voyage, and everyone aboard it, with nothing more than a single displeased thought. Corinth itself, sitting right at that narrow isthmus, claimed him as a special patron, and the Isthmian Games became one of that city's great sources of pride and income, drawing visitors and honor to a stretch of land that, without Poseidon's name attached to it, might otherwise have remained just a convenient shortcut between two seas. It's worth mentioning, too, that Poseidon's own waters produced one more resident of Olympus before Poseidon's own reign ever really got going in earnest, though not through any act of his. Generations before Poseidon ever drew his lot, when Cronus struck down his own father Uranus at the very start of everything, the severed remains fell into the sea, and from the foam that gathered around them, a fully grown goddess rose out of the water near the island of Cyprus. Aphrodite, older by that account than nearly every Olympian who'd eventually claim her as a niece, was technically born inside Poseidon's own domain before he'd ever taken formal possession of it. A strange little detail that meant the goddess of love and the god of the sea shared a permanent, unspoken kinship with the very water both of their stories began in, whatever else divided them across the centuries that followed. There's a particular epithet worth knowing too, beyond Earthshaker, Poseidon Sota, the savior, invoked by sailors caught in genuine danger, the last desperate prayer of a crew watching their ship take on water in a storm they had no way of surviving without divine mercy. It tells you something important about how ordinary Greek people actually related to this god, day to day, far from the drama of titans and monsters and jealous nieces. He wasn't just a source of danger to be feared from a safe distance. He was also, in the right circumstances, the only hope a drowning sailor had left to call on, proof that even the most temperamental god in this whole family's story still commanded genuine, desperate devotion from the people whose lives depended on his mood, one wave at a time. Let's pause the myths for a second, the way I did once before with his brother, and ask the same plain question. What kind of god was this, really, once you strip away the trident and the temper and just look at the pattern underneath? He was a god who never fully got over finishing second. Zeus got the sky, Poseidon got 2/3 of the world, and spent the next several thousand years making sure everyone remembered exactly how much that still wasn't enough. He built more than he destroyed, if you're counting carefully, a spring for a drought-stricken kingdom, a walled city, the first horse to ever thunder across open ground, and then destroyed most of it again the moment his pride got bruised. Ask Athens, still keeping a salt spring on their own Acropolis 3,000 years later, just in case. He held a grudge, the way other gods hold a scepter, constantly, absent-mindedly, without ever quite realizing how heavy it had gotten until somebody's entire decade-long voyage home depended on him finally setting it down. He loved his children fiercely, whether they turned out heroic or monstrous, and rarely made much distinction between the two once the loving started. Theseus and the Cyclops both got a father's full attention. Neither one of them got much say in how that attention eventually got used. He took what he wanted more often than any god ought to, and the ancient storytellers rarely made him answer for it, not because what he did was ever excusable, but because that's simply how this whole family's power worked, generation after generation, and Poseidon, whatever else set him apart from his brothers, never once broke from that particular family tradition. Was, more than either of his brothers, a god of the ordinary, unglamorous, life and death stakes that actual mortals actually lived with. Zeus ruled kings and prophecies and grand cosmic order. Hades ruled the dead, a kingdom every mortal eventually joins but rarely thinks about day to day. Poseidon ruled the crossing you had to make today, this afternoon, if you wanted to trade with the next city over, or fish for your family's dinner, or simply get your own son home from a war 3 seas away. That's a very different, much more immediate kind of power than his brothers ever had to wield, and it might be why the old prayers to him sound less like flattery and more like genuine, desperate bargaining. You don't butter up the ocean, you just hope it lets you cross. If Zeus was the storm that reshapes a kingdom from a distance, Poseidon was the wave that decides, in the space of a single afternoon, whether you make it home for dinner at all. That's the god this whole telling has been circling all night. Let's see what became of his temples once the world stopped needing to bargain with him quite so urgently. Let's take a moment to look around Poseidon's own court, the way I once took you around his brother's table, because a kingdom this size didn't run on Poseidon's power alone, and the cast of characters populating the waters beneath him is worth knowing before we finish this telling. Nereus came first, chronologically speaking, an old sea god, gentle and truthful, ruling these same waters long before Poseidon ever drew his lot and moved in. The Greeks called him the Old Man of the Sea, and unlike nearly every other figure in this whole family's history, he was known for honesty rather than trickery, for wisdom rather than temper, father to the 50 Nereids, including Amphitrite herself. Poseidon's arrival didn't erase him so much as absorb him. Nereus retreated to a quieter corner of the same waters, respected elder statesman to a kingdom that had, in every practical sense, already been his first. Triton, Poseidon and Amphitrite's own son, served as his father's herald and trumpeter, blowing that great conch shell to calm rough waters whenever Poseidon rode out across his domain, half man and half fish, the very image so many later ages would borrow whenever they needed to picture what a merman actually looked like. Proteus, another of the old sea gods, was famous for shape-shifting, and for a gift of prophecy he guarded jealously, willing to answer any question put to him only if you could catch and hold him through every transformation he threw at you to escape the asking, a trick Menelaus himself once used. Wrestling the shifting old god into submission on a beach in Egypt to learn the fate of his fellow Greek commanders on their long, difficult journeys home from Troy. And then there's Anna, whose story carries real tragedy inside it, even by this family's standards. A mortal woman driven to madness by Hera's cruelty, punished simply for having raised the infant Dionysus after Semele's death. Anna leapt into the sea with her young son in her arms rather than face the horror her madness had already caused. Poseidon and Amphitrite, moved by pity rather than anger for once, transformed both mother and son into sea deities on the spot, rather than letting the sea simply claim them as ordinary drowning victims. Anna became Lakatha, the white goddess, a gentle spirit known ever after for young drowning sailors, and it was Lakatha, not Poseidon himself, who threw Odysseus her own magic veil during the storm that finally wrecked his raft off the coast of Phaeacia, a small act of mercy from someone who understood, better than almost anyone else in this whole sprawling family, exactly what it felt like to be swallowed by water with nowhere left to turn. It's worth noticing, gathering this whole underwater court together in one place, how much gentler most of it is than Poseidon himself. Nereus, honest and calm. Triton, a herald rather than a warrior. Lakatha, spending her whole second life rescuing the very sailors her king might otherwise have drowned without a second thought. Poseidon ruled over all of them, and yet so much of the actual mercy dispensed beneath his own waves seems to have come from the gods serving under him rather than from the king himself. Maybe that's simply how a kingdom this vast and this dangerous manages to function at all. The throne handles the fury, and everyone gathered quietly around it handles whatever's left of the kindness. Let's end this long list of children on a gentler note, because not everything Poseidon touched needed conquering, punishing, or grieving over, and the story of Rhodes is one of the few in his whole catalogue that reads almost like a genuine, uncomplicated love story from start to finish. Rudder was a sea nymph, daughter of Poseidon and Amphitrite both, one of the rare children in this whole telling actually born from his own marriage rather than some pursuit or disguise or momentary appetite, and she gave her name to an island that rose fresh up out of the sea during the Ullus days of the world's ordering, back when Zeus and his brothers were still dividing up which gods would watch over which stretches of land. The story goes that when the gods first drew their lots for the various territories of the earth, the sun god Helios happened to be away, tending his daily chariot across the sky, and missed the whole proceeding entirely. By the time he returned, every region had already been claimed by somebody else, and Helios, understandably frustrated at having been left out of an arrangement he'd had no chance to participate in, was told that a new island would soon rise from beneath the waves, reserved specially for him if he was patient enough to wait for it. That island was Rhodes, and when it finally broke the surface of the sea, Helios looked down and saw Poseidon's own daughter standing there to greet him, and fell for her immediately and completely. Rudder became his bride, and the island took her name, and together they had 7 sons who grew up wise and accomplished enough that the island flourished under their descendants for generations, eventually becoming one of the great centers of art, philosophy, and maritime trade in the whole ancient Mediterranean world, home, many centuries later, to one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world in its own right, the great bronze colossus that once stood astride its harbor in honor of Helios himself. It's a lovely little story to end on, precisely because nothing about it needed fixing, avenging, or apologizing for by the time it was finished. A daughter, born from an actual marriage rather than a conquest. An island, rising fresh and unclaimed from the very sea her father ruled. A sun god, arriving late to his own inheritance and finding something far better waiting for him than the territory he'd originally missed out on. And a whole flourishing civilization, generations later, built on nothing more complicated than 2 gods falling for each other the moment they finally met. Not every story in Poseidon's long, difficult history needs to end in a curse, a monster, or a grudge nursed for centuries. Sometimes, if you look in the right corner of the sea, you'll find an island that simply rose up out of the water at exactly the right moment, and everything that followed turned out fine. There's one more hero worth following before we close in on the end of this telling, because his story picks up a thread you've already heard tonight and carries it somewhere genuinely spectacular, before ending in exactly the kind of humbled collapse this family's stories seem to reserve for anyone who forgets their place. Bellerophon was a young prince, and by several accounts, another of Poseidon's own mortal sons, exiled from his home city after an accidental killing and taken in by a foreign king who, testing the young man's character, sent him on a mission that looked very much like a death sentence. Hunt down and kill the Chimera, a monster breathing fire from a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail, all fused into one impossible, rampaging creature. Bellerophon needed a mount capable of striking from the air, safely out of reach of the Chimera's flames, and the one creature suited to the job was Pegasus, the very winged horse born from Medusa's death, wild and unbroken, grazing near a sacred spring that no mortal had ever managed to approach closely enough to tame. Athene, taking pity on the young hero, gave him a golden bridle and instructions on how to use it, and Bellerophon, guided by the goddess's gift, finally succeeded where every previous attempt had failed. He rode Pegasus down out of the sky and killed the Chimera from above, exactly the advantage he'd needed, and returned home a legend in his own lifetime. For a while, that's exactly where his story might have ended, a triumphant hero riding a winged horse, beloved across the whole of the Greek world. But success, in this family's stories, has a way of curdling into the exact same flaw that undoes nearly every mortal who gets too close to divine power without remembering the distance that's supposed to stay between them. Bellerophon decided he'd earned a seat on Olympus itself. He mounted Pegasus one final time and tried to fly all the way up to the god's own mountain, uninvited, convinced that a man who'd killed a monster no one else could touch had rightfully earned a permanent place among the very beings who'd helped him do it. Zeus did not agree. He sent a single gadfly to sting Pegasus mid-flight, and the horse, startled, threw his rider from an impossible height. Bellerophon survived the fall by most tellings, but was crippled and blinded by it, and spent the rest of his life wandering the earth alone, avoiding the sight of other people entirely, a hero so thoroughly humbled by his own final overreach that he chose isolation over ever being seen again in the broken state his ambition had left him in. Pegasus, freed of his rider, continued on alone to Olympus, where he was welcomed properly this time, and spent the rest of his existence carrying Zeus's own thunderbolts, a horse born from tragedy who ended up, in the end, exactly where his fallen rider had once tried and failed to reach. It's worth noting whose son actually paid the price in that story, and whose son got the happy ending. Poseidon fathered the overreaching hero who fell. Poseidon, in a sense, also fathered, through Medusa, through his own earlier act of violation in Athene's temple, the horse who succeeded where that hero could not. Two children of the same god, born from entirely different circumstances, and only one of them made it all the way up the mountain in the end. You already know the bull that started Minos's whole tangled tragedy, the one Poseidon sent up from the sea as proof of Minos's claim to the throne, the one Minos was supposed to sacrifice back and instead kept for himself, the one whose theft led directly to Pasiphae's curse and the birth of the Minotaur in the labyrinth below. What that earlier telling didn't cover is what became of the bull itself, once its part in that particular tragedy was finished. Poseidon, furious at having been cheated of his promised sacrifice, didn't simply curse Pasiphae and walk away satisfied. He drove the bull itself mad and let it loose across the island of Crete, where it rampaged for years afterward, trampling crops, terrorizing villages. An ongoing punishment against Minos's kingdom that outlasted even the Minotaur's own eventual birth and containment within the labyrinth. It fell eventually to Heracles to deal with the creature as one of his own famous 12 labors, capturing the Cretan bull alive, wrestling it into submission with his bare hands, and hauling it bodily across the sea back to mainland Greece to present to the king who'd assigned him the task. That king, unimpressed or simply uninterested in keeping a divinely maddened bull as a pet, released the creature rather than keeping it, and the bull wandered free across the Greek mainland for years afterward, eventually settling near the plain of Marathon, where it became known as the Marathonian bull and continued terrorizing the local countryside until a young Theseus, yes, the same hero you already know from his own story tonight, finally hunted it down and sacrificed it properly. Generations after Poseidon had first sent it up from the sea, in an entirely different context altogether. It's a strange, looping little detail to end this particular thread on, but it's worth noticing anyway, because it shows you something true about how Poseidon's anger actually worked across this whole family's history. It didn't stay contained to the moment it was provoked. A single broken promise from one king in one specific year produced a curse that outlived that king's entire reign, terrorized an island, then a mainland, and finally required two separate heroes, a generation apart, just to clean up the mess a single sea god's wounded pride had left scattered across half of Greece. That's the shape of this particular temper, one more time, laid out across decades instead of days. Cross him once, and the consequences don't politely stay where you left them. They wander, they multiply, and eventually they become somebody else's labor to finish. Here's something worth stepping back to notice now, the same way I once paused to notice it about his brother's own sprawling bloodline. Trace enough of these stories back to their root, and you'll find Poseidon sitting quietly at the foundation of an enormous share of the ancient world's kingdoms, cities, and legendary bloodlines, whether the people living in them ever stopped to remember exactly whose grandson their king happened to be. Theseus's line gave Athens one of its two great founding heroes, alongside Cecrops and the earlier kings tied to Athene's own patronage. Pelops's line, however it actually began, a god's genuine affection for a broken young prince, produced the house of Atreus, and with it, the very general who commanded the entire Greek fleet at Troy. Tyro's twin sons, born of a disguised river god's deception, founded Iolcus and Pylos both, seeding a chain of consequence that ran from the voyage of the Argo all the way down to wise old Nestor, still giving counsel on that same Trojan beach a full generation later. Minos's Crete, though fathered through Zeus and Europa, rather than Poseidon directly, still answered to Poseidon's fury the moment its king reneged on a single broken promise, involving a sacred bull, proof that even bloodlines belonging to other gods entirely weren't beyond the reach of this particular temper once it had genuinely been provoked. Add to that the countless smaller threads, roads, risen fresh from his own daughter's marriage to the sun. Aegena's grandson Achilles, technically descended through Zeus's own eagle disguise rather than Poseidon, and yet fighting a war that Poseidon had every reason to take a very personal interest in, thanks to a broken promise over a set of walls two gods once built with their own hands. It's worth sitting with the scale of that for a moment, the same way I asked you to sit with it once before. This wasn't simply a temperamental god scattered here and there across isolated stories, cracking open the earth whenever his pride took a hit. This was, in its own way, an entire second architecture of power running alongside his brothers, just as extensive, just as consequential, built out of chariots and shipwrecks and disguised rivers instead of thunderbolts and showers of gold. And when the Trojan War finally came, calling on nearly every one of these bloodlines at once, Poseidon didn't watch it unfold as a disinterested outsider the way you might expect the ruler of an entirely separate domain to. He watched it as a father, a grandfather, a jilted laborer still owed for an honest decade of stonework, and an old rival still nursing one particular grudge over an olive tree that had never fully healed. Every side of that beach, in some fashion, ran back through water he'd once touched personally. That's the quiet truth sitting underneath this whole long telling, the same as it sat underneath his brothers. Being one of the most powerful gods in existence never once stopped either of them from also being, in the most literal sense imaginable, everybody's business. The sea doesn't stay in its own lane. Neither, as it turns out, does the god who rules it. You already know how this part goes, in the broadest strokes, because you heard it once before about his brother. Empires rise, philosophers start asking uncomfortable questions, a new faith spreads faster than anyone tending an old altar expects it to, and eventually an emperor's decree closes the door on a religion that had stood for the better part of 2,000 years. That's the shape of it for the whole family, Poseidon included, and I won't pretend his own ending played out any differently in the broad, historical sense. But there's a particular flavor to how his worship faded that's worth telling in its own right, because a sea god's temples close a little differently than a sky god's do. When the Roman Empire absorbed the Greek world, Poseidon crossed over the same way his brother did, wearing a new name. Neptune, the Romans called him, keeper of the very same trident, ruler of the very same waves, worshipped by an empire whose entire trade network and military reach depended, even more than the old Greek worlds had, on ships crossing open waters safely and often. If anything, Neptune's practical importance to Rome only grew with the empire's size: more ports, more fleets, more sailors with genuine, daily reasons to fear and flatter the god who decided whether their crossing went smoothly. The Isthmian Games continued for centuries under Roman rule as well, alongside the Olympics, alongside every other great festival the old world had built around its gods, right up until the same edict from Theodosius that silenced Olympia and Delphi closed these gates too, in that same brief, decisive window at the end of the 4th century. The pine wreaths stopped being handed out. The altars at Corinth, and at every coastal shrine from one end of the Mediterranean to the other, stopped receiving their sacrifices, one by one, as the new faith spreading through the empire declared the old gods finished. Here's the detail I find myself thinking about most, though, when I consider how a sea god's worship actually ends compared to sky gods. Zeus's power had always been most visible in dramatic occasional moments: a thunderbolt, a specific war, a single oracle's rare pronouncement. Once the temples closed, that kind of power simply had nowhere left to be witnessed. But the sea itself never stopped being dangerous. Ships kept sinking. Storms kept rising without warning. Sailors kept drowning, exactly as they always had, whether or not anyone left an offering at a temple beforehand. So in a strange way, Poseidon's actual domain, the wave, the storm, the drowning, never went anywhere at all. Only the explanation for it changed. Sailors still feared the sea exactly as much after the temples closed as they had before. They simply stopped calling the danger by his name and started calling it, depending on the century and the faith, an act of God or bad luck or simple physics, and the god who'd once demanded a bull sacrificed at every shoreline before a safe crossing quietly became, over the centuries, just weather, just water, just the ordinary, indifferent danger of the deep, no longer requiring anyone's permission or appeasement at all. That's a stranger kind of ending than his brother got, if you think about it. Zeus's power faded because the thunder stopped meaning anything divine. Poseidon's power faded even though the sea never once got any safer, never once stopped taking ships and sailors exactly as hungrily as it always had. The danger stayed. Only the god's name attached to it slipped quietly out of use, one drowned sailor's forgotten prayer at a time, until nobody left standing on any shore anywhere still thought to ask his permission before setting out. And yet, the same way his brother's stories outlasted his brother's altars, Poseidon's name never fully vanished either. Sailors still call an especially violent, unexplained wave a rogue, but plenty of old assaults, even now, half joke about Neptune's temper when the sea turns without warning. Every science that studies the ocean floor still, technically, borrows his name for its patron in half-serious dedications. Every hurricane that spins up out of warm water and takes a coastline by surprise carries, if you squint hard enough through the modern explanation, the exact same signature this god carried through every one of the stories you've heard tonight. Force too large to reason with, arriving from the one direction you can never fully prepare for. The temples are gone. The bulls stopped being sacrificed at the shoreline centuries ago. But the water's still out there, doing exactly what it's always done, indifferent to whether anyone remembers whose name used to explain it. That's the whole of him, friend, birth to trident to temple to tide. Every god in this family eventually loses the throne. This one just never really lost the ocean. Let the fire burn down. Let the water do the rest of the talking tonight.